And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Ben Webster, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called The Soul of Ben Webster, released in 1959. This album takes us through some beautiful Ben Webster compositions. He has a bluesy, swinging style of play throughout the album. Collaborating with him on this album, Art Farmer, Milt Hinton and Mo. Jazz Round Midnight was released in 1993. This one's a great album full of stirring ballads. Webster had a unique, soulful, emotional style with ballad playing, and this compilation showcases that. Ben Webster for Lovers was released in 2005. This album was released on Valentine's Day in 2005. It contains more ballads beautifully performed by Ben Webster. His band comprises Gerry Mulligan and Oscar Peterson. Music for Loving was released in 1955. This album sees Harry Carney playing alongside Ben Webster. Their playing style is contrasting, and that brings out the magic of the music. Ben Webster is very soft and nostalgic, and Carney is very intense. Together they treat the audience to more ballads. The music has a Duke Ellington orchestral feel to it. And Ben Webster's Finest Hour, released in 2000, another ballad-oriented album. On this album, Ben Webster performs in various settings. He's joined by various guest artists from Coleman Hawkins to Fletcher Henderson to Oscar Peterson. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Ben Webster, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called The Soul of Ben Webster, released in 1959. This one's a great album of mainstream jazz and bop songs. His band include Art Farmer, Milt Hinton and Mo. So back in the day, there were several great jazz saxophone players, and Ben Webster was at his best with this album. He has that swinging, bluesy solo style throughout the album. A great compilation of original songs by Ben Webster and his band. The next album is called Jazz Round Midnight, released in 1993. So if you're in the mood for some great, beautiful, relaxing jazz, this is a great album. Contains classics like Round Midnight, Some Other Time and I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good. And it's set in a 50s, 60s jazz setting. Very mellow, relaxing music. Also, this album brings together everything Ben Webster was famous for, his beautiful ballads playing. And there's 15 ballads on this album. A very romantic saxophonist, Ben had a way of stirring the depths of emotions with his playing. His saxophone playing is warm and soulful. He's also backed by Oscar Peterson and Ray Brown on the album. Another album, Ben Webster for Lovers, released in 2005. So this album is a compilation of romantic ballads, contains some great songs like When I Fall in Love, that's the opening track, and then takes us through a series of classics. Also joining Webster on this album is a star cast like Gerry Mulligan and Oscar Peterson. Soulful romantic music. Also, Ben Webster has a unique way of interpreting a jazz classic. This album was released on Valentine's Day in 2005 and contains some of Webster's best ballads from his stint at Verve Records, another great album compilation of romantic ballads. Another album called Music for Loving, released in 1955. So on this album, Ben Webster teams up with Harry Carney and others to give us an insight into his ballad playing. Most of the tracks are jazz classics. Ben Webster was famous for his mellow, soulful playing, and these tracks showcase this. One of the highlights of the album is the way Harry Carney on baritone sax contrasts with Webster on tenor sax. Carney is very dynamic and intense on baritone, and Webster's soft, mellow melodies perfectly blend in with the latter. Most of the songs are a throwback to the mid-20th century. They have the Duke Ellington orchestral feel to them. There's some great interpretations of hits by Gerald Wilson and Billy Strayhorn like Chelsea Bridge and Early Autumn. Harry Carney is particularly great on the tracks It Had to Be You and Shalmo. And an album called Ben Webster's Finest Hour, released in 2000. This album compilation gives us an insight into Webster in various settings. There's several guest artists on the tracks, from Fletcher Henderson to Coleman Hawkins to Oscar Peterson. Two of the highlights, La Rosita alongside Coleman Hawkins and Chelsea Bridge alongside Gerry Mulligan. Ben Webster's unique style comes across on the tracks, a dynamic sound on upbeat tunes and soft rollicking ones on ballads. The tracks range from Stardust to While We Are Dancing to Chelsea Bridge and more. So that was some insight into more of Ben Webster's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Ben Webster, his life and times and best hits. And now it's time for more promo news. Louis Stringer is an up-and-coming jazz artist hailing from Britain, and his style is all about blending the groundbreaking with the traditional. He started out as a self-taught artist playing the bass from YouTube tutorials. Then his luck changed when he won a scholarship to the Royal Birmingham Conservatory. He started taking up jazz music full-time. He was then noticed by UK saxophone legend Soweto Kinch, who began touring and performing alongside him. He later began touring with the National Youth Jazz Orchestra. In 2021, he started touring with another award-winning band, The Spin, and went on to win several awards for his music. The BBC once featured him, heralding him as a star. He's particularly good at playing classics from the Great American Songbook by ear. He said that he's memorized more than 300 tunes from the songbook and can perform any of them from memory. So Louis Stringer is definitely an artist to look out for. He's got some great performances lined up. On October 10th, he's going to be performing at the South Jersey Jazz Festival. From 2025 to 27, he's set to be lead bassist at Valley's Cafe Jazz Club, one of the iconic jazz clubs in the country. He's also got concerts lined up at the award-winning Lily Pad Music Venue, also at Lincoln Center in New York. So that was some insight into an up-and-coming artist from the jazz scene, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Ben Webster's best albums of all time. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua De Silva. On this week's episode, Ben Webster, his life and times and best hits, and during this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called See You at the Fair, released in 1964, a great saxophone jazz album. It pits Webster alongside a star cast of musicians from Richard Davis to Hank Jones to Ossie Johnson. The next album is called The Ultimate Ben Webster, released in 1998. This one's another great compilation of jazz songs from Ben Webster in the 50s. All his best recordings from Verve Records are here, from songs like Tenderly to Early Autumn to Chelsea Bridge and more. Also, on this album, there's a glimpse of the playing of other great artists like Dinah Washington, Coleman Hawkins, Roy Aldridge and others. My Romance was released in 1990. This was another great collaboration album between Webster and saxophonist Houston Person. Person was a star in the jazz and R&B format. He joins Webster here for some renditions of romantic classics. The next album is called In Norway, released in 2013. This was taken from a concert performance in Norway. The album sees Webster performing some timeless classics with piano backing. And an album called At the Renaissance, released in 1985. This album takes us back to the 60s club setting, and we are treated to a wonderful mix-up of solos and band performances. Webster's backed by rising stars like Frank Butler, Red Michel and more. A great live performance compilation also featuring some great solos. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua De Silva. On this week's episode, Ben Webster, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called See You at the Fair, released in 1964. This was Ben Webster's final album for Impulse Records before relocating to Europe, and it puts him alongside a star cast of musicians from Richard Davis to Hank Jones to Ossie Johnson. Also, his take on the ballads is something spectacular here. Nobody could rock a ballad like Webster did it. Someone to Watch Over Me is performed in style, and there's something about Art Pepper's style in how he performs Over the Rainbow. The classic Lullaby of Broadway plays out as an harpsichord song. It was the early 50s, and this album is the definition of a great 50s saxophone jazz album. The next album is called Ultimate Ben Webster, released in 1998, another great compilation of jazz songs from Ben Webster in the 50s. All his best recordings from Verve Records are here, from songs like Tenderly to Early Autumn to Chelsea Bridge and more. Also on this album, there's a glimpse of the playing of other great artists like Dinah Washington, Coleman Hawkins, Roy Aldridge and others. Also in this album, we get a glimpse of Ben performing in various settings, from small group settings to orchestral settings. Also there's some tracks where he plays piano instead of saxophone. The album also features an introductory essay written about Ben Webster. So it's also a great way to start out listening to Ben Webster's music. This album is a great introduction to his music and various styles. My Romance was released in 1990. So this one's another great collaboration album between Webster and saxophonist Houston Person. Person was a star in the jazz and R&B format, and he joins Webster here for some renditions of romantic classics. Beautiful timeless hits like Laura, Time After Time and My Romance play out as sax and piano duets here. In Norway was released in 2013. So at the time of this album, Ben Webster was in his latter days. An interesting anecdote, he almost didn't make the trip to Norway because he was seasick. However, he did get there in time for the concert, and alongside pianist Tara Sandnes, he belts out some favorites in front of a Norway audience. There's also an emphasis on Duke Ellington in the album compilation. Ellington was one of his mentors, and there's some great Ellington classics here like Cottontail, Satin Doll and In a Mellow Tone. At the Renaissance was released in 1985. So this album takes us back to a 60s club setting, and we are treated to a wonderful mix-up of solos and band performances by Webster. He's backed by rising stars like Frank Butler, Red Michel and more. The band members were just starting out, but even back then they worked together very well. There's some great solo performances on classics like Stardust, Caravan, Ole Miss Blues and more. Frank Butler's drum melodies were ahead of his time. Some of the highlights: Georgia on My Mind, which plays out as a warm sentimental song. Caravan and Ole Miss Blues is portrayed very innovatively, and Stardust, a warm nostalgic piece. So that was some insight into some of Ben Webster's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua De Silva. and welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Ben Webster, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of today's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were talking about on this program. So Ben Webster was one of the leading saxophonists in jazz. He had a unique style that put him above the rest. He would typically play intensely and switch to soft and nostalgic on ballads. He influenced countless other players of his generation and was himself a big adherent of Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young's style of saxophone playing. He toured and performed alongside several bands from the Duke Ellington Orchestra to Art Tatum's orchestra and produced some timeless albums like Soulville, King of the Tenors and more. Soulville was released in 1958. This is a must-have for Ben Webster fans. The styles are varying, but the playing of Webster's saxophone puts everybody in a consistent mood, sweet and romantic. King of the Tenors was released in 1954. So Ben Webster was at his best with the ballads, and this album showcases this. It is also Ben Webster's debut album. Jazz Round Midnight was released in 1993. This one's a great album full of stirring ballads. Ben Webster's joined by Oscar Peterson and Coleman Hawkins on the tracks. Webster had a unique, soulful, emotional style with ballad playing, and this compilation showcases that. And The Ultimate Ben Webster released in 1998. Another great compilation of jazz songs from Ben Webster in the 50s. All his best recordings from Verve Records are here, from songs like Tenderly to Early Autumn to Chelsea Bridge and more. Also on this album, there's a glimpse of the playing of other great artists like Dinah Washington, Coleman Hawkins, Roy Aldridge and others. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. You can check out my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan, for archives of today's show. And that brings me to an end of this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva.